Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar based out of the US for IAC partners. Just to give you a little background, today we'll focus our discussion on medical device product development. We do still have a few attendees starting to join into this webinar, so while we wait for them to join, let me pose a question. What percentage do you think that your development costs makes up of the total cost of the life of your product? So let me just say that question one more time. What percentage do you think the development cost of your product makes up of the total cost of that product's life? So I think we'll just give everyone just another 30 seconds to hop onto this call. Want to make sure everybody has a chance to join in and get themselves situated before we get started. All right, well, I think we've given a few minutes now for everyone to join and get situated into the call. So I did pose a question to everyone, and that question was, what percentage do you think that the development cost of your product makes up for the total cost of the life of that product? And actually what you'll find is that for most medical devices, the development cost ends up being anywhere from 30 to 50% of the total cost of the life of the product. As you can tell, that's quite a significant portion of the cost of the product, which is why it's so important to make sure that you control your budget and optimize your development plan. So my name is Frank Caruso, and I'm a senior consultant at IAC Partners based out of Chicago. This webinar will be moderated by my colleague, Philippe. He will also be the one who will manage the Q&A session at the end. We are hosting this webinar remotely together, so as much as we would like to be able to reply to each question throughout the presentation, it's a bit complex with us not being in the same room. So feel free to ask your questions at any point throughout the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer all of them at the end. This webinar will be broken up into 3 sections. The first one is very straightforward, where we'll just talk about the different impacts that affect the profitability of a project, looking at a traditional MPV model. Then we'll deep dive into a case study that we've worked with our client before and highlight some of the insights that we found from that case study. And lastly, we'll move into the Q&A session that I mentioned before. Before we do get started, let me just give a brief overview of IAC for those of you who don't know us. So in a nutshell, IAC is a family-owned boutique consulting firm that started in France. We do specialize in industrial strategy, from market assessments and product development and implementation to go-to-market strategy. Our teams are unique, where we consist of a blend of engineers and management consultants, as well as industry veterans. And we have had a strong track record in the healthcare and life and science industry, working with our clients across the globe. Now that you know a little bit about us, let's get to more of the good stuff. So first, let's focus on the budget and planning. So what really impacts the profitability of a project? So in product development, there are two critical objectives to keep in mind, and that is your budget and your time to market. Just so that we are clear, before we deep dive into those two topics, I do want to touch on what we mean by medical devices. So we do have three different types of medical devices that we sort of group into three segments. The first one are personal medical devices. These devices are products that will stay with the patient. They are personal to that patient. It could be things such as a wheelchair, an insulin pump, Band-Aids, other devices along those lines. The second type of medical device would be an equipment. That equipment could usually be an MRI machine, an X-ray, a CAT scan, any sort of medical device equipment. And then lastly, there's in vitro devices. These devices usually require a bottle or reagent for the examination of some sort of specimen. The business plan and the market for these three types of medical devices does differ. However, the approach we'll be deep diving into will address all types of these products, as we're focused mainly on the actual development of the project and the budget of that project. So what we see here is a typical NPV assessment of a project where you can see you're incurring your cost during the development of that project, and then the curve starts to come upwards as you start to sell that project on the market. You can see that we've also included an optimized cash flow. And I'll go into what are the levers that are actually affecting that optimized cash flow and how can you achieve that on your NPV. The first lever that you see, and one of the more important levers, is obviously reducing that non-recurring cost. When you reduce your non-recurring costs, it's quicker to get across that barrier of profitability on a project. The quicker you reach that profitability, the better the overall NPV becomes of that project. The second key lever we'll be focusing on today is optimizing the development planning. Really what we mean by that is that the quicker to market you can release that product, the better effects it will have on the NPV. By carefully considering these two levers, you can greatly improve the NPV of any project. There is also a third lever that we do like to talk about, which has to do with maximizing your cash flow. What we mean by that is either by selling more of the product, meaning increasing your revenue, or by reducing your operating cost, whether that's through the TCO of the product, whether it's an actual improvement on the cost of goods of the product, something that improves your overall profit on each sold product. Really, the objective is to optimize the profitability of the project, but also to limit the drifts. It's not uncommon when working on these longer projects to see a $20 million project end up costing $30 million because of poor planning or unforeseen circumstances that cause issues and delays. We've also seen cases where a launch date of 2018 was planned and it quickly gets pushed out to 2019 or 2020. When we do assess these three levers, equivalencies can be found. These equivalencies do raise the question, what trade-off should be made? So for example, you can find yourself in a scenario where you could carry out a 2-month study that will reduce the cost of the product by $100. But if you see that saving $100 on the cost of goods of the instrument results in the same NPV as releasing that instrument 2 months earlier on the project, is it actually worth doing that if that study were to delay the product by 2 months? Understanding what these trade-offs are for the project planning is important so that you can make smarter, better decisions when trying to figure out what actions need to take place. Now let's take a deep dive into a case study. So IAC was working with one of our clients, a leading medical device player. Essentially, the program director had met with the executive committee, and he committed to a firm budget and development schedule and felt that the team could deliver the project within that scope. However, this program director does know that typically there have been times where this company has faced issues and has struggled, whether it was from the budget of the project or sometimes to actually complete the project on time. So he wanted to ensure that this wouldn't be the case with this project. So he hired IAC, and we worked with them to identify any blind spots and help them to make sure that there was no exceeding of that budget. So what you'll see is that typically the budget is built on a history-based approach. So the client will typically take a look at how their other projects were done, how long it took them, and what that cost. And then using this top-down approach, we'll develop a budget for this upcoming project. When we first took a look at this project, everything seems to make sense. It looks like they spent $10 million and that they were scheduled to spend $10 million. So you would assume that this project is on time and we still are well in the scope of what we plan on delivering. However, we don't actually know if the project stands at this point from a development perspective. All we know is that we planned on spending $10 million and we've spent $10 million. Did we actually deliver that $10 million? Or was it that we only delivered $5 million worth of development? Or was it $7 million worth of development? It's unclear, especially when taking this top-down approach to building your project plan and your budget. It makes it very difficult then to anticipate any drift that can occur in this budget, whether it's through a delay in the project timeline or a drift in the cost that's required to meet the product's goals. This is why we recommend, and in this case, move forward with building an activities-based budget. To do this, we need to build a bottom-up budget approach so that we can identify the value that goes into each task and understand if we spent $10 million and actually delivered $10 million worth of work. It's really to provide clarity on what has been done. As you can see in this case, there is quite a bit of uncertainty between the budget and the duration, highlighted in that yellow area. So until now, money really wasn't a limiting factor, and this wasn't considered the case. Teams would usually initiate these 3 steps, but not to the degree that was necessary to be proactive and ensure a smooth project delivery. Essentially, this 3 steps is to build this activity-based budget and then ensure that it's used throughout the life of the project. The first step in this approach is to plan. Really, the goal here is where we worked with the client to build a value stream map and making sure that within this value stream map, we include all of the external and internal teams. Once you build this activity-based value stream map, it's easier to see the interdependencies between the teams. The second step in this process is to actually secure and identify the risks. Really, what we mean by that is to shift from a more reactive risk management policy and turn it into a more proactive risk management policy. So we're really securing any risk and developing action plans to reduce those risks. And then lastly, it's really about driving this change and really making sure that all of the work that's gone into the planning and to the risk assessment continues to drive and be with the project team throughout the long life cycle of this product development. So we'll now deep dive a little bit more into each of these 3 steps. But before we get there, it is important that we also continue to work with our client from a change management perspective so that their teams can understand what tools and strategies we're using so that they can learn how to do them themselves and implement them on the next project. Now let's take a first look at this plan phase. As I said before, it is critical to build the value stream map. Essentially, to build this value stream map, we do it through collaborative workshops that's bringing together cross-functional teams. This allows us to identify where the interdependencies exist between the internal teams as well as external suppliers. We really want to make sure that any key supplier that's providing an input for the project is included in this value stream map, because it can cause delays if they don't deliver what's needed of them. So from this project with our client, we were able to identify the key activities, understanding the value that was that those activities create, and also we're able to create some milestones that the project team could reach for, and to identify the bottlenecks that really existed in the plan, which was really bottlenecks from different dependencies needing before you could start a task. The team now felt that they had a fuller view on the project and were working in a more collaborative manner. So the next phase is where we shift into the risk assessment. And really, this is where we want to shift the mindset from reacting to scenarios to proactively managing scenarios. We did this by conducting interviews with the 9 departments involved on the project so that we could understand what concerns they had with this project development. Those concerns would mainly be around any technical concern, any economic concerns, such as not having the resources, and anything from a planning perspective where they felt, hey, we might have issues because we need these inputs from another department before we can start this, and we think that there is going to be a risk there. In this specific scenario with our client, we discovered that the highest risk was with their software development team. It was great that we identified this risk, and what we did was we worked with that client to build an action plan so that we could mitigate those risks, which was really about understanding which part created that risk and why that team was uncertain, and essentially hammering down the best way to alleviate that risk. With the departments, we were also able to identify individual tasks that were high-risk areas and then assess how those tasks impacted the key KPIs. Which this brings us into the second phase of our secure step. And really, this step is to understand what specifications are required of the product and what's really driving those specifications and how much value do those specifications give. What we wanted to do is take a look at all the specifications and look at it from an end-to-end approach. So what did the customer want? What was marketing driving for? And how was R&D able to handle that? In this case, what we ended up identifying is there were 75 must-have specifications that marketing provided the project team. What we then did is we assessed those 75 specifications in an objectified way and utilized the consistent constraints, such as what resources were available, what milestones did we want to hit, and how did those specifications tie into those milestones, and what workload was actually required to reach those specifications. So were some specs requiring more software development, while other ones requiring more firmware development? Was there more electrical engineering needed? Once we looked at all of these constraints, what we were able to do was identify 11 specifications that, although they were important, they didn't provide as much value and support to the overall NPV of the project as the other 64 specifications. This allowed us to take those specifications, put them on a to-do list for an update in the future for the product so that we can make sure that we hit the time to market that we wanted to achieve, while also making sure that we didn't impact the MPV too greatly. The team overall was very happy with this, as there was alignment from the marketing group, the R&D group, as well as the IT group. Everybody having the transparency that they needed to see on these specifications made them much more comfortable with the planning moving forward. Having these decisions based on an objectified view, looking at how it actually impacts the MPV, really helps to drive why this step is necessary, and it's easy for teams to understand how those different specs impact the actual project outcome. So now the most important step is to actually drive this change. It's really important to make sure that there is a single point of truth where it's easy for each of these cross-functional teams to check in and understand the status of the project. Typically, these teams are very fragmented and are working in separate areas, whether it's in the office, whether it's remotely. So it's important that there's one point of reference that everybody knows is the most up-to-date point on this project plan. What we've found through working with our clients is that visual task management programs, such as IOBA as an example, really help to manage this project plan. These tools bring a visual layer to the actual management of like the project plan data. So what you'll end up seeing is that it's a lot easier to access an IOBA sheet versus going through a Microsoft project plan of 10,000 lines for a 5-year product development lifecycle. Really, the goal of these tools is to avoid being too precise, that it overwhelms the team, but also then providing enough precision that the team knows where the interdependencies exist and what's needed of them. So really, it can help to provide the clarity on how much money the project has spent versus how much has actually been delivered. So in this example with our client, in this case study that we had, we were actually able to use IOBA, and they were able to actively manage the progress that they made on the project versus what was planned. And they felt that these tools enabled the team to collaborate more effectively, especially while working remote, since they were all accessing the same project plan and could easily and quickly review any changes or updates that came to the project plan. What's great also about these project plans is that you are able to generate reports, and these reports are customizable and very visual, so you can decide, depending on who the report is needed for, what information is relevant versus what can be left out. I'm sure, as like all of us, you have experienced the impact of COVID-19. So for this project, it was critical that we assess the impact of COVID-19, especially on the suppliers, as some of the suppliers did have some critical inputs for the product to continue the development. So what we were able to do with the client was identify which suppliers were critical and then negotiate with those suppliers to secure the critical supply and to adapt the schedule to the new changes that had come from this negotiation with the supplier. Again, when talking about the impact of COVID, it's always important to understand what are the trade-offs and how does it impact the MPV. At the end of the day, we always want the products to have the best MPV for our clients. So overall, after 3 months, we had a better picture of the overall project plan. As you can see, there was initially a lot of uncertainty. But after ISC support, we were able to reduce that uncertainty to the blue there that's highlighted. And really, we reduced this uncertainty in 3 ways. The first one was by reducing the risk impact by about 8 months. So essentially, the project could have potentially bled into the end of 2022, where we were able to reduce that impact into the Q1 of 2021 at worst case scenarios. Secondly, we were able to improve the transparency on the cost of the project activities, which allowed us to have less variance between overspending on the budget or even underspending on the budget, because we knew more likely what the costs were going to be. And the last way we were able to reduce that uncertainty was that we were able to adapt the characteristics of the project to actually meet what was planned in the budget. And that was through the NPV analysis of those inputs from marketing and the trade-offs with what R&D could deliver, what marketing was pushing for, and what the customer expected and would pay for. So to quickly summarize the 4 levers we discussed to secure your budget and optimize your project plan, the first one, as I said, is about building that bottom-up project plan using a value stream map. It's what allows you to really understand how much value is delivered for each activity that is done, and you can then compare that to the budget spent. The second lever is to work with each department to proactively identify the risk that they have, whether they're concerned with a technical risk, an economic risk, or a planning risk, and then building an action plan to mitigate those risks. The third lever is to actually arbitrate between what specs really drive the NPV versus which ones can potentially be pushed off into an update, as they don't as greatly affect the NPV and could be more seen as a future nice to have update in the product. And then lastly, and most importantly, it's about deploying those effective management tools so that the team can continue to follow this project plan and continue to be successful with implementing it throughout the long life cycle of the product development. We also can't forget to keep in mind that there are external impacts such as COVID-19, and that it's always critical to assess these situations and to really assess how COVID-19 will impact the NPV of a product. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you enjoyed the information that we presented here today and the case study we've shown. Now I will introduce my colleague Philippe, who will take over the Q&A session to hopefully give you guys more insights that you're looking for. Thanks again. Philippe, I'm not sure if I'm able to hear you or if that's just me.
Philippe is on mute right now. Please, Philippe, unmute yourself.
Sorry for this technical glitch. I was on mute, and thank you all for joining. I will try to answer all the questions that were asked on the chat. We had a few others and some creative answers to the initial question of Frank at the beginning of the seminar, and we will try to answer that as well. So going chronologically compared to the presentation, there was an interesting question about the NPV, and especially when you're already on the market, you sell a product, and you estimate that going faster to market will not improve your NPV because you're basically replacing the sale of your old product by the sale of a new product, and you don't see the impact on the NPV. Technically, it's true. If both your old and the new product sell the same, with the same volume at the same price, but usually when you develop a new product, it's for a reason. It can be maintaining sales figures, it can be adding features to keep up with the market demand, it could be managing obsolescence. Most of the time, medical devices are devices that are developed for 10, 15, 20 years, sometimes on the market, and at some point, some supplies for key components fade away, and you need to re-engineer your product to keep up with that issue. Most of the time, we see that in the electronic boards, for instance. CPUs of 20 years ago are not CPUs available today. So on your top line, the impact is the new product sells generally more and generally at a higher price. The basic reason is usually that it's more in line with the current market needs. It could also simply be the marketing power that you can have, having a product that is more appealing to your client. On your bottom line, your old product being replaced incurs this obsolescence cost. It's an extra burden that you're carrying that you weren't carrying 10 years ago. And getting the new product faster to market will allow to get this extra burden, this extra fat away much faster. And sorry if it's not very streamlined, we try to jump between the different questions. So an interesting question also is about, we know how to measure budget and how we measure the quantity, but how do we measure the quantity of value built? It is not linear. It's true, it's not linear, and there is not a one-size-fits-all answer. In a perfect world, your customer value of your product would be an aggregate of the value, the sum of the value of all of its features. And therefore, you will be able to allocate a percentage of these values into your development budget for each discrete feature and its enablers.